The gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Socorro, New Mexico territory. But it wasn't the sound that made Rosalie Montgomery's heart stop. It was the terrified whinny of her horses as they bolted, her wagon lurching forward with nobody at the reins. She screamed, dropping the package she'd been carrying and lunging for the back of the runaway wagon, her fingers barely catching the wooden edge as her feet left the ground. The year was 1878, and in that moment, Rosalie was certain her 22 years of life were about to end on the main street of a town she'd only arrived in 3 days prior. Thomas O'Connor had just stepped out of the saloon when he spotted the runaway wagon barreling down the street, a woman's pale blue dress fluttering as she dangled precariously from the back. Without hesitation, his long legs carried him into the street, his worn boots kicking up dust as he sprinted alongside the wagon, ignoring the shouts of bystanders who scrambled to get out of the way. "Hold on, madam," he shouted, his deep voice carrying over the thundering hooves and creaking wheels. With a final burst of speed, he caught up to the side of the wagon, his strong hands gripping the wooden frame as he pulled himself up. His hat flew off, revealing sandy brown hair as he maneuvered his way toward the front, fighting against the violent rocking of the wagon. Rosalie felt her grip weakening, her fingers slipping against the smooth wood as the wagon hit another rut in the road. Her auburn hair had come loose from its pins, whipping around her face as she tried desperately to pull herself up. She caught sight of movement to her right, a man climbing alongside the wagon with the agility of someone who'd spent his life around horses. "I can't hold on," she cried out, feeling one hand slip free. Thomas reached the front of the wagon, grabbing the reins and pulling back with all his might. "Whoa, steady now," he called to the frightened horses, his voice firm but calm. The animals responded to his command, their pace beginning to slow, but not before the wagon hit another bump, nearly throwing Rosalie from her precarious position. In that moment, Thomas made a split-second decision. He secured the reins, then turned and made his way back to where Rosalie clung to the wagon. "I've got you," he said, reaching out to grasp her wrist just as her fingers lost their grip. With a strength born of years working on ranches, he pulled her up and into the wagon, her body colliding with his as the wagon finally came to a stop. For a moment, they stayed that way, her trembling form pressed against his chest, his arms instinctively wrapped around her to keep her safe. Rosalie could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong despite the chaos they'd just survived. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaky as she pulled back slightly to look at her rescuer. His eyes were a striking blue against his sun-bronzed skin, concern evident in their depths. "Are you hurt, miss?" Thomas asked, helping her to sit properly on the wagon seat as he checked her for injuries. Rosalie shook her head, still trying to catch her breath. "Just frightened, I think." She smoothed her hands over her skirt, noticing a tear in the fabric. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't." She trailed off, the reality of how close she'd come to serious injury or worse suddenly hitting her. Thomas gave her a reassuring smile. "No need to think about that now. You're safe." He glanced back toward town, where a crowd had gathered, watching from a distance. "What spooked your horses?" "There was a gunshot," Rosalie explained, pushing a strand of hair from her face. "I had just picked up supplies and was about to climb back onto the wagon when it happened." Thomas nodded, his expression darkening slightly. "Saturday nights in Socorro can get rowdy. Someone probably fired into the air without thinking." He looked at her more carefully. "You're not from around here, are you?" Rosalie shook her head. "I arrived just a few days ago. My uncle left me his property when he passed the Montgomery place about 5 miles east of town." Recognition flickered in Thomas's eyes. "Old Samuel Montgomery's place. I knew him, good man. I'm sorry for your loss, miss. Montgomery, Rosalie Montgomery, she replied, extending her hand. And you are Thomas O'Connor, he said, taking her hand briefly. His touch was warm and calloused, the hands of a working man. Most folks just call me Tom. A shout from town interrupted them as the sheriff made his way toward them. Everything all right out there? Thomas stood up, offering Rosalie his hand to help her down from the wagon. We're fine, Sheriff Parker, he called back. Just a runaway wagon, but no harm done. Sheriff Parker approached, his weathered face creased with concern as he looked at Rosalie. Miss Montgomery, isn't it? Samuel's niece. Rosalie nodded, impressed that news traveled so quickly in Socorro. Are you hurt, madam? The sheriff asked. I'm fine, thanks to Mr. O'Connor, she replied, glancing at Thomas with gratitude. The sheriff nodded, looking at Thomas with a mix of respect and wariness. Good work, O'Connor. Though I'm surprised to see you in town. Thought you were out at the Rocking H. Thomas shrugged. Just came in for supplies. Heading back tomorrow. Something in the exchange made Rosalie curious about her rescuer, but before she could ask any questions, the sheriff tipped his hat. Well, Miss Montgomery, if you're sure you're all right, I'll get back to my rounds. Been trying to keep things peaceful with the cattle drivers in town. After the sheriff walked away, Rosalie turned to Thomas. Thank you again, Mr. O'Connor. I don't know how to repay you. Thomas waved away her thanks. No need for payment, Miss Montgomery. Anyone would have done the same. But Rosalie had seen the crowd watching from a safe distance, and she knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would have risked their life for a stranger. At least let me offer you a meal. I was planning to cook tonight, and it seems wrong to eat alone after what you did for me. Thomas hesitated, glancing toward the saloon where he'd left his belongings. Something in his expression suggested he wasn't accustomed to accepting invitations, especially from young women he'd just met. But there was something in Rosalie's earnest expression that made it difficult to refuse. I suppose I could help you get those supplies back to your place, he finally said. Make sure you get home safely. Relief washed over Rosalie's face. Thank you, I'd appreciate that. She glanced around. Though I think my packages are scattered all over the street now. Thomas gave her a slight smile. Let's gather them up, and I'll get my horse from the livery. I can ride alongside your wagon to make sure those horses of yours don't get any more ideas. As they collected her scattered purchases, Rosalie found herself stealing glances at the tall cowboy who'd saved her life. There was something compelling about him, a quiet strength and a hint of mystery that made her curious. Little did she know that this chance encounter would change both their lives forever. Thomas returned with his horse, a handsome chestnut gelding that stood patiently as he secured his saddlebags. Rosalie noticed how gently he handled the animal, speaking to it in low tones that she couldn't quite make out. Ready? He asked, mounting his horse with the easy grace of someone who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. Rosalie nodded, climbing up onto her wagon seat with considerably more caution than before. She took the reins, giving them a gentle shake as Thomas rode alongside her. As they left Socorro behind, the landscape opened up before them, rolling hills covered in sparse vegetation. The distant mountains, a purple silhouette against the darkening sky. The silence between them was comfortable, broken only by the creak of the wagon and the steady rhythm of hooves on the dusty road. Have you been in New Mexico territory long, Mr. O'Connor? Rosalie finally asked, curious about the man riding beside her. Thomas's expression remained neutral. About 5 years. Came out from Texas after the war. The Civil War? Rosalie asked, surprised. Thomas didn't look old enough to have fought in a conflict that had ended 13 years earlier. A small smile tugged at his lips. No, madam. I meant the range wars in the Texas Panhandle. I was just a boy during the war between the states. Rosalie nodded, realizing he was probably in his late 20s, several years older than her, but not as much as she'd initially thought. The hard life of the frontier tended to age a person quickly. And you, Miss Montgomery, what brings a young lady like yourself all the way to New Mexico territory alone? Thomas asked. Rosalie's hands tightened slightly on the reins. There wasn't much left for me in Boston after my parents passed. Uncle Samuel was my only remaining family, though I hadn't seen him since I was a child. She sighed. By the time I received word that he'd left me his property, he was already gone. I arrived too late for the funeral. Thomas's expression softened. Samuel spoke of a niece back east. He was proud of you, said you had a good education. You knew him well? Rosalie asked, surprised. Our properties adjoin. The Rocking H, that's the Henderson Ranch where I work, borders your uncle's land to the north. Samuel and I would occasionally help each other with various tasks. Thomas looked away, his expression unreadable. He was a good neighbor. As they approached the turnoff to the Montgomery property, Rosalie felt a strange mixture of emotions. She'd only spent 3 nights in her new home, and it still felt foreign to her, this inheritance from an uncle she barely remembered. The small ranch house with its wooden porch and faded blue shutters came into view as they crested a small hill. It's not much, Rosalie said, suddenly self-conscious about the modest property. Not compared to what I imagine the Rocking H must be. Thomas shook his head. Your uncle built this place with his own hands. It's solid and well-placed, good water supply from that creek and enough grazing land for a small herd. He glanced at her. Do you plan to stay? The question caught Rosalie off guard. Did she plan to stay? She hadn't thought beyond arriving and settling her uncle's affairs. I'm not sure, she admitted. I don't know the first thing about ranching. Thomas dismounted as they reached the house, coming around to help her down from the wagon. It's not an easy life, he said, his hands strong and steady as they circled her waist, lifting her down. Especially for someone on their own. For a brief moment they stood close, his hands still at her waist, her own resting lightly on his shoulders. Rosalie was suddenly very aware of how improper this situation might appear to an observer, a young, unchaperoned woman inviting a man she'd just met to her home. But they were miles from town, and after the day's events, social niceties seemed less important. I should get those supplies inside, she said, stepping back. Thomas nodded, moving to unhitch the horses. I'll take care of your team while you do that. Rosalie gathered her packages and headed inside, grateful for his help, but also needing a moment to compose herself. The small ranch house was sparsely furnished but clean. She'd spent her first days in Socorro scrubbing every surface, trying to make the place feel like somewhere she could call home. She set about preparing a simple meal: beans, bacon, and biscuits from the supplies she'd purchased in town. It wasn't the elaborate fare she'd been taught to prepare in Boston, but it was hearty and filling. When Thomas entered after caring for the horses, he removed his hat, revealing sandy brown hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. Your horses are settled, he said, standing somewhat awkwardly just inside the door. They should be fine now, but you might want to have the blacksmith check that harness. One of the straps was wearing thin. Thank you, Rosalie replied, gesturing toward the small table she'd set. Please sit. The food is ready. Thomas hesitated for just a moment before taking a seat. As Rosalie served the meal, she noticed how he waited for her to sit before picking up his fork, a small courtesy that spoke of good manners despite his rough exterior. This is good, he said after taking a bite. Been a while since I've had a home-cooked meal. Do you not cook at the ranch? Rosalie asked, curious about his life. Thomas shook his head. We have a cook at the Rocking H for the ranch hands, but I've been out at the line cabin for the past month, keeping an eye on the northern pastures. Just simple fare out there. It must be lonely, Rosalie observed. Something flickered in Thomas's eyes, a momentary vulnerability quickly masked. I prefer it that way, he said simply. Less complicated. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Rosalie gathered the courage to ask. The sheriff seemed surprised to see you in town. Is there a reason for that? Thomas set down his fork, regarding her carefully. I don't come into Socorro much. No reason to. Rosalie sensed there was more to the story, but she didn't press. Instead, she changed the subject. My uncle's attorney mentioned that he kept a small herd of cattle. I haven't ventured far enough from the house to locate them yet. They'll be in the south pasture this time of year, Thomas replied. About 30 head if I recall correctly. Samuel had a young man helping him, Roberto Martinez. Lives with his family about 2 miles east. He'll know where everything is. Rosalie nodded, grateful for the information. I should call on them tomorrow. I can show you the way if you'd like, Thomas offered, then immediately looked as though he regretted the words. That is, if you'd feel comfortable with that arrangement. Rosalie smiled, touched by his consideration for her reputation. I would appreciate the help, Mr. O'Connor. I'm afraid I'm quite lost when it comes to ranching. As they finished their meal, Rosalie found herself studying Thomas when he wasn't looking. There was something about him, a wariness, as if he expected trouble at any moment. Yet he had risked his life to save hers without hesitation. Such contradictions intrigued her. After they'd cleared the dishes, Thomas glanced out the window at the darkening sky. I should be heading back, he said, reaching for his hat. It's getting late, Rosalie observed. The bunkhouse has a spare bed if you'd prefer not to ride in the dark. Thomas's expression was unreadable. That wouldn't be proper, Miss Montgomery. A young woman alone with a man she barely knows. People would talk. There's no one around to talk, Rosalie pointed out. And after what happened today, I'd feel safer knowing someone was nearby. Thomas considered her words, seemingly torn between propriety and practicality. Finally, he nodded. I'll stay in the bunkhouse then, but I'll be gone at first light. Relief washed over Rosalie. Though she tried to appear brave, the thought of spending another night alone in this unfamiliar place had been unsettling, especially after the day's events. Thank you, she said quietly. Thomas put his hat back on, tipping the brim slightly. I'll see to my horse and turn in. Good night, Miss Montgomery. Good night, Mr. O'Connor, she replied, watching as he stepped out into the gathering darkness, his tall figure silhouetted against the fading light. Rosalie closed the door behind him, leaning against it for a moment. In just one day, her life in Socorro had become far more complicated than she'd anticipated. Yet as she prepared for bed, she found herself looking forward to the morning and the chance to learn more about the mysterious cowboy who had saved her life. Dawn broke over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. Rosalie had been awake for over an hour, unable to sleep with the knowledge that Thomas O'Connor was just a short distance away in the bunkhouse. She dressed carefully in her most practical skirt and blouse, her hair neatly pinned up under a modest bonnet. When she stepped outside to draw water from the well, she saw Thomas already up and tending to his horse. He'd clearly been awake for some time, his face freshly shaved and his shirt clean if somewhat worn. Good morning, Mr. O'Connor, she called, setting down her bucket. Thomas turned, touching the brim of his hat. Miss Montgomery, I hope you slept well. Better than expected, she replied honestly. I've prepared some breakfast if you'd care to join me before we ride out. A flicker of surprise crossed his features. You still want to visit the Martinez family today, of course, Rosalie said. Unless you've changed your mind about showing me the way. Thomas shook his head. No, madam. I gave my word. Over a simple breakfast of coffee, bacon, and cornbread, Rosalie noticed that Thomas seemed more at ease than he had the previous evening. He even offered a few stories about her uncle, painting a picture of a man who was respected by his neighbors and known for his fair dealings. He never took to raising large herds, Thomas explained. Said he preferred quality over quantity. His cattle always fetched good prices at market. I wish I'd known him better, Rosalie said softly. Our family wasn't one for correspondence, and after my parents died, I lost track of him entirely until I received the attorney's letter. Thomas studied her for a moment. You have his eyes, he said unexpectedly. Same shade of green. And that determined look when you're thinking hard about something. Rosalie blushed slightly, both from the personal observation and the realization that Thomas had been watching her closely enough to notice such details. Thank you for telling me that. It's nice to know I carry something of him with me. After breakfast, they saddled their horses, Thomas insisting that Rosalie ride her uncle's gentle mare rather than taking the wagon. The path to the Martinez place cuts through some rough country, he explained. Easier on horseback. As they rode out, Rosalie found herself grateful for the riding lessons she'd taken as a girl in Boston, though Western saddles were different from what she was accustomed to. Thomas rode beside her, occasionally pointing out landmarks or features of the land that might be important for her to know. That creek never runs dry, even in the worst droughts, he said, indicating a winding stream. And those hills to the south mark the boundary of your property. Beyond that is Hargrove's land. He's not the friendliest neighbor, so it's best to respect the boundary markers. Rosalie absorbed the information eagerly, trying to commit it all to memory. There's so much to learn, she said, feeling somewhat overwhelmed. Thomas glanced at her. You're thinking of staying, then? The question hung between them, more significant than it might seem on the surface. I'm considering it, Rosalie admitted. I don't have much waiting for me back east. I worked as a schoolteacher after my parents passed, but it was never truly satisfying. Teaching's an honorable profession, Thomas remarked. It is, Rosalie agreed, but I always felt confined. There were so many rules about how a respectable young woman should behave, who she could speak to, where she could go. She looked out at the vast landscape surrounding them. Out here, everything feels different. Challenging, yes, but also more real. Thomas nodded slowly. The territory has its own rules, though they might not be written down like in Boston, and it can be unforgiving to those who don't respect its ways. Is that why you came here? Rosalie asked. For the freedom, a shadow crossed Thomas's face. Something like that, he replied vaguely. Before she could inquire further, he pointed ahead. That's the Martinez place. The small adobe house came into view, smoke rising from the chimney. As they approached, a young man emerged from a corral, raising his hand in greeting when he recognized Thomas. Senor O'Connor, he called. It has been some time. Thomas dismounted, shaking the young man's hand. Roberto, good to see you. This is Miss Montgomery, Samuel's niece. Roberto turned to Rosalie, his expression shifting to one of respect and sympathy. Ah, Senorita Montgomery, your uncle was a good man. We were very sorry to hear of his passing. Rosalie slid from her saddle, accepting Roberto's hand. Thank you. I understand you helped my uncle with his cattle, senorita, for 3 years now. Pride was evident in the young man's voice. I have been caring for them since Don Samuel fell ill. I would be grateful if you would continue, Rosalie said. At least until I determine what to do with the property. I would pay you the same wage my uncle did, of course. Relief washed over Roberto's face. Gracias, senorita. My family depends on this work. As if on cue, a woman appeared in the doorway of the house, wiping her hands on her apron. Roberto waved her over. "My mother, Senora Martinez." "Mama, this is Senorita Montgomery, Don Samuel's niece from Boston." The older woman hurried forward, her weathered face breaking into a warm smile. "Welcome, Senorita. Please, you must come inside and take refreshment." Despite Thomas's subtle attempt to decline, they soon found themselves seated at the Martinez family table, being served strong coffee and fresh tortillas. Senora Martinez fussed over Rosalie, clearly delighted to have a visitor. "Don Samuel spoke of you often," she told Rosalie. "He was very proud of his educated niece." As they talked, Roberto and Thomas fell into a conversation about cattle prices and grazing conditions, their heads bent together as they discussed the upcoming season. Rosalie was struck by how easily Thomas interacted with the Martinez family. There was none of the reserve he had shown with her. "Senor O'Connor has been good to us," Senora Martinez said quietly, following Rosalie's gaze. "When Roberto's father died 2 winters ago, he helped us repair our roof before the snow came." "You've known him long?" Rosalie asked, trying to sound casual. The older woman nodded. 5 years now. He came to work for Senor Henderson when the trouble in Texas was finished." She lowered her voice. "A good man, but with sadness in his heart. He keeps to himself mostly." Rosalie wanted to ask more, but Thomas and Roberto had finished their conversation and were rising from the table. After arranging for Roberto to continue caring for the cattle and promising to return soon, Rosalie found herself once again riding beside Thomas, heading back toward her property. "The Martinez family seems very fond of you," she observed. Thomas kept his eyes on the trail. "They're good people." "Senora Martinez mentioned you helped them after Roberto's father died." Thomas shifted in his saddle, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "It was nothing. Anyone would have done the same." "I'm beginning to think that's your answer for everything," Rosalie said with a small smile. "And yet, I'm not convinced it's true. Not everyone would risk their life for a stranger as you did for me yesterday." Thomas glanced at her, then quickly away. "You'd be surprised what people are capable of when necessary." "Both good and bad, I imagine," Rosalie said thoughtfully. "You mentioned range wars in Texas. Were you caught up in that violence?" For a long moment Thomas was silent, and Rosalie feared she had overstepped. Finally he spoke, his voice low. "I was. Worked for a rancher named Davidson in the Panhandle. Good man, fair employer. When the trouble started with the neighboring ranch, he tried to keep the peace." Thomas's jaw tightened. "It didn't work out that way." "What happened?" Rosalie asked gently. "What always happens when men decide that land and power are worth killing for," Thomas replied grimly. "People died who shouldn't have. I left after that, headed west. Ended up here." The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and Rosalie understood that there was more to the story, much more that he wasn't sharing. But she didn't press, sensing that his trust wasn't easily earned. They rode in silence for a while, cresting a hill that offered a view of her property spread out below them, the small ranch house, the barn and corral, and beyond that, the pastures where her uncle's cattle grazed. "It's beautiful," Rosalie said softly. Thomas nodded. "Your uncle chose well. This land has good water and shelter from the worst of the winter winds." He pointed to a distant line of trees. "That's where your property meets the Rocking H." "And where is your line cabin?" Rosalie asked, curious about where he spent his solitary days. Thomas indicated a spot near the tree line. "Just beyond that rise, can't see it from here." "So we're neighbors in a way," Rosalie observed. A flicker of something interest crossed Thomas's face. "In a manner of speaking, though it's a fair ride between properties." As they approached the ranch house, Rosalie realized she was reluctant for their time together to end. Despite his reticence, Thomas's company had been surprisingly enjoyable, and the prospect of being alone again was less appealing than it had been just a day earlier. "Would you care to stay for lunch?" she asked as they dismounted. "It's the least I can offer after you've spent the morning showing me around." Thomas hesitated, his expression conflicted. "I should get back to the rocking H. Been away longer than I planned already." Disappointment settled in Rosalie's chest, though she tried not to show it. "Of course. I understand." Thomas tied his horse to the hitching post and helped Rosalie unsaddle her mare, his movements efficient and practiced. As they worked side by side, their hands occasionally brushed, sending an unexpected warmth through Rosalie's body. "I appreciate all your help, Mr. O'Connor," she said as they finished. "Truly." Thomas nodded, his eyes meeting hers briefly before looking away. "If you need anything, Roberto can get word to me. The Rocking H hands come into Socorro every few weeks for supplies." "Will you be one of them?" Rosalie asked, unable to stop herself. Thomas hesitated. "Probably not. As I said, I don't go to town much." Rosalie wondered again at his reluctance to visit Socorro but didn't question him further. Instead, she extended her hand. "Well, thank you again for saving my life yesterday. I won't forget it." Thomas took her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "Be careful with those horses, Miss Montgomery. And maybe practice your driving in an open field before tackling the main street again." The teasing note in his voice surprised her, as did the slight smile that accompanied it. For a brief moment, she glimpsed what Thomas O'Connor might be like when he wasn't guarding himself so carefully. "I'll take that under advisement, Mr. O'Connor," she replied with a smile of her own. As he mounted his horse and rode away, Rosalie stood watching until his figure disappeared over the rise. Only then did she acknowledge the strange emptiness his departure left behind, an emptiness that made no sense given they'd only just met. Shaking her head at her own foolishness, Rosalie turned back to the house. She had a ranch to learn about and decisions to make. There was no time for girlish fancies about a cowboy who clearly preferred solitude to company. Yet as the days passed and Rosalie threw herself into learning about her new property, thoughts of Thomas O'Connor continued to surface at unexpected moments. Roberto proved an invaluable teacher, patiently explaining the basics of cattle ranching and helping her understand the ledgers her uncle had kept. But whenever they rode near the northern boundary of the property, Rosalie found herself scanning the horizon, hoping for a glimpse of a familiar figure on horseback. 2 weeks after the incident with the runaway wagon, Rosalie made her second trip into Socorro, this time with Roberto riding alongside to ensure there would be no repeat of her previous misadventure. The small town was busier than on her first visit, with several cattle drives having arrived in the area. As they tied their horses outside the general store, Sheriff Parker approached, tipping his hat. "Miss Montgomery, good to see you again. Getting settled in at Samuel's place?" "Yes, thank you, Sheriff," Rosalie replied with a smile. "Roberto has been helping me learn the ropes." The sheriff nodded approvingly. "Good to hear. Town's a bit rowdy today. Cattle buyers in from Kansas City. Might want to finish your business and head back before sundown." "We intend to," Rosalie assured him. As the sheriff turned to leave, she found herself asking, "Have you seen Mr. O'Connor in town recently?" Sheriff Parker's expression shifted subtly. "O'Connor? No, can't say that I have. He tends to keep his distance from Socorro, especially when it's busy like this." "Is there a reason for that?" Rosalie pressed gently. The sheriff studied her for a moment, as if deciding how much to say. "That's something you'd have to ask him, Miss Montgomery." but I will say this: Thomas O'Connor is respected in these parts, even if some folks are wary of him." Before Rosalie could inquire further, a commotion erupted from the saloon across the street. The sheriff sighed. "Duty calls. Good day to you, Miss Montgomery." Inside the general store, Rosalie was greeted warmly by the proprietor, Mr. Wilson, a jovial man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose. "Miss Montgomery, wonderful to see you again. How are you finding life at the ranch?" "It's certainly different from Boston," Rosalie admitted with a smile. "But I'm learning." As she selected the items she needed, coffee, flour, sugar, and other staples, Mr. Wilson chatted amiably about local news and the upcoming Harvest Festival. Roberto had gone to inquire about a replacement part for a broken plow, leaving Rosalie to complete her purchases. "Oh, and Mr. Wilson, do you have any books?" she asked. "I've read through the few my uncle kept in the house." Mr. Wilson brightened. "Indeed I do, Miss Montgomery. Not a large selection, mind you, but I try to keep a few titles in stock for the more literary-minded citizens of Socorro." He led her to a small shelf at the back of the store. "Feel free to browse while I prepare the rest of your order." Rosalie ran her fingers along the spines of the handful of books, mostly practical guides to farming and ranching, a Bible, and to her surprise, a volume of Emerson's essays. She was reaching for the latter when a voice behind her made her turn. "Wouldn't have taken Samuel Montgomery's place for a hotbed of transcendentalist thinking." Thomas O'Connor stood a few feet away, a small crate of supplies in his arms and the ghost of a smile playing at his lips. "Mr. O'Connor," Rosalie exclaimed, unable to hide her pleasure at seeing him. "What a surprise!" "For me as well," he replied. "Thought you might be back in Socorro before long, but didn't expect to run into you here. Are you in town with the Rocking H men?" Rosalie asked, noting that he seemed tenser than when they'd last parted. Thomas shook his head. "Just a quick trip for necessities, planning to be gone before the saloons get too busy." "The sheriff mentioned cattle buyers are in town," Rosalie said. "Is that what brings the Rocking H hands in?" "Partly," Thomas replied. "Mr. Henderson likes to keep an eye on prices before deciding when to sell." He nodded toward the book she'd been reaching for. "You like Emerson?" Rosalie smiled, pleased by his recognition of the author. "I do. Self-reliance was a particular favorite during my teaching days." "Nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind," Thomas quoted quietly. Rosalie couldn't hide her surprise. "You've read Emerson." A flush crept up Thomas's neck. "Had a lot of time for reading during winter months at the line cabin. Your uncle lent me a few books over the years." The image of this rugged cowboy reading philosophy by lamplight was unexpectedly appealing. "Then I should definitely purchase this," Rosalie said, taking the volume from the shelf. "Perhaps when I'm finished, I could lend it to you." Thomas seemed about to reply when the store's door swung open with a bang. 3 men entered, their spurs jingling loudly against the wooden floor, their voices carrying in the small space as they called out greetings to Mr. Wilson. Rosalie noticed how Thomas stiffened, turning slightly away from the newcomers. "Cattle buyers?" she asked quietly. Thomas shook his head minutely. "Drovers, from the Bar T outfit." One of the men spotted them and nudged his companion. "Well, look who's in town." O'Connor himself, gracing Socorro with his presence. Thomas set down his crate on a nearby counter. "Beck, Flynn, Simpson." His acknowledgement was curt, his posture tense. The leader of the 3 Beck, Rosalie assumed, sauntered closer. He was a large man with a bushy mustache and cold eyes. "Surprised to see you here, O'Connor. Thought you preferred to hide out at that line cabin of yours." "Just getting supplies," Thomas replied evenly. "No trouble intended." Beck's gaze shifted to Rosalie and his expression changed, a smile that didn't reach his eyes spreading across his face. "And who might this lovely lady be?" Before Thomas could respond, Rosalie stepped forward. "Rosalie Montgomery. I've recently taken over my uncle's property east of town." Recognition flashed in Beck's eyes. "Samuel Montgomery's place. Heard he passed. My condolences, madam." He tipped his hat with exaggerated politeness. "Dirk Beck at your service. My friends and I work for the Bar T Ranch." "Miss Montgomery was just completing her purchases," Thomas said, his voice carrying a warning note that Rosalie found both puzzling and oddly protective. Beck's smile widened. "Well now, no need to rush off on our account. Always a pleasure to meet a new neighbor, especially one so charming." He stepped closer to Rosalie. "Perhaps I could buy you a drink at the hotel, Miss Montgomery, more civilized than the saloon for a lady such as yourself." Rosalie felt Thomas tense beside her. "Thank you, Mr. Beck, but I must decline. I have a long ride ahead and need to start back soon." Beck's expression hardened slightly. "Another time, perhaps." His gaze shifted back to Thomas. "You escorting the lady, O'Connor. Mighty generous of you, considering your usual habits." "Roberto Martinez is with me," Rosalie interjected, sensing the growing tension. "Mr. O'Connor and I simply happened to cross paths here in the store." As if summoned by his name, Roberto appeared in the doorway, stopping short when he saw the gathering. His expression grew wary as he noted the Bar T men. "Señorita Montgomery," he called. "The blacksmith has the part we need. We should collect it before heading back." "Of course, Roberto," Rosalie replied, grateful for the interruption. She turned to Mr. Wilson, who had been watching the exchange with obvious concern. "I'll take the Emerson, please, along with my other purchases." As Mr. Wilson hurried to wrap her items, Beck and his companions moved further into the store, though Beck's gaze remained fixed on Thomas with undisguised hostility. "I'll see these loaded onto your wagon," Thomas said quietly to Rosalie, taking the parcels from Mr. Wilson. Outside, away from the tense atmosphere of the store, Rosalie finally asked, "What was that about? Those men seem to have a particular dislike for you." Thomas secured the last of her packages in her small wagon. "Old disagreements, nothing for you to worry about." Roberto, who had been checking the horses, approached. "Bar T has been pushing boundaries lately, señorita. Their cattle have been found on Rocking H land more than once." "Rustling?" Rosalie asked, alarmed. "Not exactly," Thomas replied. "Just testing limits, seeing what they can get away with." "It happens." Rosalie frowned. "The way that man Beck spoke to you, it seemed more personal than a simple boundary dispute." Thomas's expression closed off. "Like I said, nothing for you to worry about." He glanced toward the saloon where more cowboys were gathering. "You should head back now before it gets any later." Roberto nodded in agreement. "Señorita, it would be better to be home before dark." Sensing that Thomas wouldn't elaborate further, Rosalie reluctantly prepared to leave. "Will you be staying in town?" she asked him. Thomas shook his head. "No, just need to pick up a few more items, then I'll be heading back to the ranch." "Perhaps." Rosalie hesitated, then continued, "Perhaps you could stop by on your way. The ranch is on your route after all. I could repay your kindness with dinner." Thomas looked surprised by the invitation, and for a moment Rosalie thought he might accept. But then his gaze drifted toward the store, where Beck and his companions were emerging, and his expression hardened. "Better not, Miss Montgomery," he said quietly, "but I appreciate the offer." Disappointment washed over her, though she tried not to show it. "Another time, then." As Rosalie and Roberto prepared to depart, she couldn't help but notice how Thomas positioned himself between her wagon and the Bar T men, his hand resting casually near his holstered revolver. The protective gesture wasn't lost on her, nor was the tension that seemed to radiate between the men. "Be safe, Miss Montgomery," Thomas said as she gathered the reins. "And you, Mr. O'Connor," she replied, wishing she understood what unseen currents were flowing beneath the surface of this encounter. As they rode out of Socorro, Roberto remained unusually quiet until they were well clear of town. "Senor O'Connor is right to be cautious, senorita," he finally said. "The Bar T men have a reputation for trouble, especially Beck." "Does it have something to do with why Mr. O'Connor avoids town?" Rosalie asked. Roberto hesitated. "It is not my place to speak of another man's business, senorita. But I will say this: there are stories about Senor O'Connor from before he came to New Mexico. Some say he was involved in killings during the Texas troubles. You believe that?" Rosalie asked, thinking of the man who had risked his life to save hers, who had quoted Emerson and helped a widow repair her roof. Roberto shrugged. "I believe he is a good man who keeps his distance for his own reasons. My father always said to judge a man by his actions, not by stories told about him." As they rode in silence, Rosalie found herself agreeing with Roberto's father. Whatever Thomas O'Connor's past might hold, she had seen nothing in his actions to suggest he was anything other than honorable. Yet clearly there was more to his story than he had shared, something that kept him isolated at his line cabin and made men like Dirk Beck regard him with open hostility. The mystery of Thomas O'Connor occupied Rosalie's thoughts throughout the journey home and well into the evening. As she placed the volume of Emerson's essays on her bedside table, she wondered if Thomas might one day trust her enough to share the truth about his past. Little did she know that events were already in motion that would force that trust much sooner than either of them expected. The following weeks brought a rhythm to Rosalie's life that was both challenging and satisfying. Under Roberto's guidance, she learned to ride the boundaries of her property, check on the cattle, and understand the basics of ranch management. The ledgers her uncle had kept revealed a modest but stable operation, with enough income to maintain the property and perhaps even expand it with careful planning. Each evening, exhausted but fulfilled, Rosalie would read a few pages of Emerson before sleep claimed her. And each day, as she rode the northern boundary of her land, she would scan the horizon, hoping for a glimpse of Thomas O'Connor. But the cowboy remained elusive, and as the days turned to weeks, Rosalie began to wonder if their paths would cross again. Then came the morning when Roberto arrived earlier than usual, his expression grave. "What is it?" Rosalie asked, setting aside the coffee she'd been preparing. "Bar T cattle were found on Rocking H land again yesterday," Roberto explained. "A confrontation occurred. Shots were fired." Alarm coursed through Rosalie. "Was anyone hurt?" Roberto shook his head. "No, senorita, but Senor Henderson has called all his men back to the main ranch. There is talk of trouble coming." Rosalie's first thought was of Thomas. "Mr. O'Connor as well," she. "The line cabins are being consolidated. It is safer that way." The news unsettled Rosalie more than she wanted to admit. Though their interactions had been brief, Thomas had become important to her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. The thought that he might be in danger made her stomach clench with worry. "What does this mean for us?" she asked. Roberto's expression was somber. "Your land lies between Rocking H and Bar T territories. If trouble escalates, you could find yourself caught in the middle, senorita." The warning hung heavy in the air. Rosalie had read about range wars in the newspapers back east, bloody conflicts over land and water rights that sometimes claimed dozens of lives. The prospect of such violence touching her new home was terrifying. "What should we do?" she asked. Roberto considered her question carefully. "For now, we continue as normal, But we must be vigilant. I will stay closer to the house for the next few days, and perhaps my brother could join us as well. Extra eyes would be wise." Rosalie nodded, grateful for his counsel. "Thank you, Roberto. I don't know what I would do without your help." They spent the day checking fences and moving some cattle away from the boundaries shared with both ranches. As they worked, Rosalie found her gaze constantly drawn northward, wondering what was happening at the Rocking H. That evening, as darkness fell, Rosalie sat on her porch, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the cooling air. The lamp beside her cast a warm glow as she attempted to focus on her book, but the words blurred before her eyes, her mind too preoccupied with worry to concentrate. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up sharply. Roberto had left for the night, promising to return with his brother in the morning. Setting aside her book, Rosalie rose, peering into the darkness beyond the circle of lamplight. A lone rider emerged from the shadows, and even before he came fully into view, Rosalie knew who it was. Relief flooded through her as Thomas O'Connor dismounted, tying his horse to the porch railing. "Mr. O'Connor," she called, unable to keep the gladness from her voice. "Roberto told me what happened. Is everything all right?" Thomas approached the porch, removing his hat. In the lamplight, his face looked tired, lines of tension around his eyes. "Miss Montgomery, I hope I'm not disturbing you at this hour." "Not at all," Rosalie assured him. "Please come inside." "You look like you could use a hot meal." Thomas hesitated. "I can't stay long. Mr. Henderson has called all hands to the main ranch, and I need to get back. But I wanted to warn you personally about what's happening." The seriousness in his tone made Rosalie's worry deepen. "Come inside," she repeated, more firmly this time. "Whatever you need to say, you can say it over coffee at least." Thomas followed her into the house, his tall frame seeming to fill the small space. Rosalie busied herself with the coffee pot, giving him time to gather his thoughts. "Bar T is making a play for water rights along the creek that runs through all 3 properties," Thomas finally said. "They've been moving their cattle onto disputed land, trying to establish usage rights." Rosalie turned to face him. "Roberto mentioned shots were fired." Thomas's expression darkened. "Beck and 2 of his men tried to divert the creek onto their land. When our foreman confronted them, Beck drew his gun. No one was hit, but it was a near thing. And Mr. Henderson has called everyone back to prepare for more trouble," Rosalie guessed. Thomas nodded, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. "Your property sits between the 2 ranches, with the creek running right through the middle. You could find yourself in a difficult position if this escalates." Rosalie sank into a chair across from him, the reality of the situation settling heavily on her shoulders. "What do you suggest I do?" Thomas took a sip of his coffee before answering. "Henderson asked me to speak with you. He's prepared to buy your cattle and lease your grazing lands until this situation resolves. You'd still own the property, but you wouldn't be caught in the middle of a range dispute. And what would happen to Roberto? His family depends on the work." "Henderson would hire him on at the Rocking H," Thomas assured her. "He's a good worker, and we could use another hand right now." Rosalie considered the offer. It was generous and would protect both her and the Martinez family. Yet something in her rebelled against the idea of retreating at the first sign of trouble. "My uncle built this place," she said slowly. "He worked this land for 20 years. I may not have known him well, but I know he wouldn't have abandoned it easily." Thomas set down his cup, studying her with new respect. "No, he wouldn't have. Samuel was as stubborn as they come when it came to what was his." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "You remind me of him in that way." The comparison pleased Rosalie more than she expected. "Tell Mr. Henderson I appreciate his offer, but I'll be staying. This is my home now." Thomas leaned forward, his expression serious again. It's not just about the land, Miss Montgomery. Beck and his men can be dangerous. After today's confrontation, they'll be looking to make a statement. All the more reason for me to stand my ground, Rosalie insisted. I won't be intimidated off my own property. Thomas shook his head, a mixture of admiration and frustration in his eyes. You don't understand what these men are capable of. Then help me understand, Rosalie said quietly. You know them, don't you? Or at least you know men like them. It's why you stay away from town, why you keep to yourself at that line cabin. Thomas went still, his blue eyes searching her face. For a long moment, Rosalie thought he might withdraw again, retreat behind the walls he'd built around himself. But something in her expression must have reached him, because he sighed deeply and began to speak. In Texas, I worked for a rancher named James Davidson. Good man, fair employer. When water disputes started with the neighboring ranch owned by the Blackwell brothers, Davidson tried to negotiate, tried to find a peaceful solution. Thomas's voice grew tight. The Blackwells weren't interested in peace. They wanted the land, the water, everything. Rosalie listened intently, sensing that this story was one Thomas rarely shared. One night, they rode onto Davidson's property 6 men, including the 3 Blackwell brothers. They shot Davidson and his wife in their bed, then set fire to the ranch house. Thomas's hands tightened around his coffee cup. I was in the bunkhouse with the other hands. We came running when we heard the shots, but it was too late for the Davidsons. What did you do? Rosalie asked softly. Thomas's eyes met hers, and in them she saw the pain of old wounds. What I had to. The Blackwells and their men opened fire on us. When it was over, 4 of them were dead, including 2 of the brothers. You killed them, Rosalie said. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded once. The surviving Blackwell brothers swore revenge, put a bounty on my head. I left Texas that night, traveled west, eventually found work with Henderson. Thought I'd left it all behind. His jaw tightened. Then about a year ago, Dirk Beck arrived in the territory, took a job with the Bar T. Understanding dawned on Rosalie. He knows about Texas. He was friends with the Blackwells, Thomas confirmed. Recognized me the first time we crossed paths. He's been looking for an excuse to finish what they started ever since. The gravity of the situation suddenly became clear to Rosalie. This wasn't just a boundary dispute, it was personal, with Thomas caught in the center of it. That's why you avoid town, she said. Why you keep to yourself. The less contact, the less chance for conflict, Thomas agreed, and the less danger for those around me. Rosalie reached across the table, placing her hand over his. You were defending yourself and your friends, she said firmly. You have nothing to be ashamed of. Thomas looked down at their hands, then gently withdrew his. It's not shame that keeps me isolated, Miss Montgomery. It's caution. Men like Beck don't care about justice or right and wrong. They only understand revenge. And now he's using this water dispute as an excuse to come after you, Rosalie concluded. Among other things, Thomas agreed, which is why you should consider Henderson's offer. I don't want to see you caught in the crossfire of a fight that isn't yours. Rosalie stood, moving to the window to gaze out at the darkness. In the distance, she could see the faint glow of the moon reflecting off the creek that had become the center of this conflict. It is my fight now, she said quietly. This is my land, my water, and you. She turned to face him. You saved my life, Mr. O'Connor. I consider that a debt worth repaying. Thomas rose as well, his expression troubled. This isn't about debts, Miss Montgomery. This is about your safety. Rosalie, she said suddenly, if we're going to face danger together, I think you should call me Rosalie. A look of surprise crossed Thomas's face, followed by something warmer. Rosalie, he repeated, her name sounding different, special when spoken in his deep voice. And I suppose you should call me Thomas, though most folks just use Tom. Thomas, she said, testing the name. I prefer it to Tom. It suits you better. A hint of color touched his cheeks, and for a moment, the tension between them shifted, becoming something else entirely, something that made Rosalie's heart beat faster and her breath catch in her throat. The moment was broken by the sound of distant hoofbeats. Thomas moved swiftly to the window, his hand going to his gun. "Henderson's men," he said after a moment, relaxing slightly. "Probably looking for me. I told them I'd be quick." Rosalie felt a pang of disappointment that their time was being cut short. "You should go, then." Thomas nodded, reaching for his hat. "I meant what I said about this being dangerous, Rosalie. Beck won't hesitate to harm you if he thinks it will get to me." "I understand the risks," she replied, walking him to the door, "but I won't be driven from my home by fear." At the doorway, Thomas paused, turning to face her. "Your uncle would be proud of your courage," he said softly, "but he would also want you to be careful." "I will be," Rosalie promised, "and I won't be alone. Roberto is bringing his brother tomorrow, and I imagine Henderson's men will be keeping a close eye on the boundaries as well." Thomas hesitated, then reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small revolver. "Take this," he said, offering it to her. "Do you know how to use it?" Rosalie accepted the weapon, its weight unfamiliar in her hand. "No, but I can learn. Keep it with you," Thomas instructed. "I'll try to come by tomorrow to show you the basics if Henderson can spare me." As he mounted his horse, Rosalie called out, "Be careful, Thomas." He looked back at her, his expression solemn in the moonlight. "You too, Rosalie. Lock your doors tonight." She watched him ride away, joining the Henderson men who waited at the edge of her property. Only when they had disappeared from view did she go back inside, the revolver still in her hand, a tangible reminder of the danger that had suddenly entered her life. That night, sleep eluded Rosalie. She lay awake, listening to every creak and whisper of the wind, the revolver on her bedside table beside the volume of Emerson. The contrast between the philosopher's words about self-reliance and the cold metal of the gun wasn't lost on her. Morning brought Roberto and his younger brother Diego, both looking grim but determined. Rosalie shared what Thomas had told her about the situation, and Roberto nodded in confirmation. "The town is talking of nothing else, señorita," he said. Bar T men were in the saloons last night, making threats against Rocking H. "And against Senor O'Connor specifically," Diego added. "They say he is a murderer from Texas." Rosalie's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "He defended himself and his friends against men who had just killed his employer. That's hardly murder." Roberto and Diego exchanged glances. "You have spoken with him about this?" Roberto asked carefully. "He visited last night to warn me of the danger," Rosalie explained. "He told me what happened in Texas." Roberto nodded slowly. "Senor O'Connor is a private man. If he shared this with you, he must trust you greatly." The observation made Rosalie's heart warm, though she tried not to read too much into it. "He's concerned that I might be caught in the middle of this dispute. Mr. Henderson offered to buy my cattle and lease my grazing land until the situation resolves." "That would be the safest course," Roberto admitted, "but I do not think it is what Don Samuel would have done." Rosalie smiled slightly. "That's what I told Thomas. I won't be driven off my own land." They spent the morning checking fences and moving the cattle to the pastures furthest from both the Bar T and Rocking H boundaries. Around midday, as they were returning to the house for lunch, Rosalie spotted riders approaching Henderson men, with Thomas among them. "We'll have company for lunch," she told Roberto and Diego, trying to ignore the flutter in her stomach at the sight of Thomas riding toward her home. As the men dismounted, Rosalie recognized Mr. Henderson himself among them, a tall, graying man with a weathered face and sharp eyes. Thomas made the introductions. "Miss Montgomery, this is William Henderson, owner of the Rocking H. Mr. Henderson, Miss Rosalie Montgomery." Henderson removed his hat, offering Rosalie a courteous nod. "Miss Montgomery, your uncle was a good neighbor and a fine man. My condolences on your loss." "Thank you, Mr. Henderson," Rosalie replied. "Please come inside. I was just about to serve lunch and there's plenty for everyone." Over a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee, Henderson laid out the situation in more direct terms than Thomas had. "Bar T has been pushing boundaries for months now," he explained. "But this latest move trying to divert the creek, that's a direct challenge. Water rights are taken seriously out here, Miss Montgomery." "I understand that," Rosalie said, "and I appreciate your offer to buy my cattle and lease my land, but I've decided to stay." Henderson studied her thoughtfully. "Thomas mentioned you might feel that way." "Your uncle had the same stubborn streak." He glanced at Thomas, who sat quietly, his attention seemingly focused on his meal. "O'Connor also mentioned that Dirk Beck has a personal vendetta against him." Thomas looked up then, his expression carefully neutral. "It's not something I've discussed widely, sir." Henderson waved away his concern. "No need for secrets now, Thomas. We all know what kind of man Beck is." He turned back to Rosalie. "The situation is more complicated than a simple boundary dispute, Miss Montgomery. Beck has been stirring up trouble since he arrived, turning the Bar T owner against neighboring ranches, spreading rumors." "About Thomas," Rosalie stated. Henderson nodded. "Among others, but O'Connor is his main target. There's talk that Beck has sent word back to Texas, letting certain parties know where Thomas can be found." Rosalie glanced at Thomas, alarmed by this news. His face revealed nothing, but she noticed the tension in his shoulders. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means the surviving Blackwell brother might come looking to settle the score," Henderson said bluntly. "And when men like that come hunting, they don't much care who gets caught in the crossfire." The warning hung heavy in the air. Rosalie looked around the table at Roberto and Diego, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, at Henderson's men, their expressions grim, and finally at Thomas, whose blue eyes met hers with a mixture of concern and something deeper, more personal. "I appreciate your honesty, Mr. Henderson," she said at last, "but my decision stands. This is my home now, and I won't abandon it at the first sign of trouble." Henderson sighed, though there was a hint of approval in his eyes. "Your uncle would say the same, I expect." He turned to his men. "Carlson, Jenkins, I want you to ride the boundary between Miss Montgomery's property and the Bar T. Keep an eye out for any sign of trouble." The men nodded, rising from the table. Henderson turned to Thomas. "O'Connor, you stay here for the afternoon. Show Miss Montgomery how to use that pistol you gave her and check the house and outbuildings. Make sure everything's secure." If Thomas was surprised by the order, he didn't show it. "Yes, sir." As Henderson and his men prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "We'll have men riding close by day and night, Miss Montgomery. If you see or hear anything suspicious, fire 3 shots in the air. We'll come running." "Thank you, Mr. Henderson," Rosalie said sincerely. "I won't forget your kindness." After they had gone, Roberto and Diego returned to their work with the cattle, leaving Rosalie and Thomas alone in the house. For a moment, an awkward silence stretched between them. "I see you kept the revolver close," Thomas finally said, nodding to where the small gun rested on a shelf near the door. "It didn't seem much use under my pillow if trouble came calling at the front door," Rosalie replied with a small smile. Thomas's expression softened slightly. "Smart thinking. But it won't do you any good if you don't know how to use it properly." They moved to the back of the house, where Thomas set up some cans on a fence post for target practice. With patient guidance, he showed Rosalie how to load, aim, and fire the small revolver. "Don't pull the trigger," he instructed, standing close behind her, his hands adjusting her grip on the weapon. "Squeeze it gently and breathe out as you do." Rosalie was acutely aware of his proximity, of the warmth of his body just inches from hers, of his breath stirring the hair near her ear. She forced herself to focus on the target, following his instructions. When she squeezed the trigger, the can flew off the fence post. "I hit it," she exclaimed, turning to Thomas with delight. His face was closer than she expected, his blue eyes crinkled at the corners with a rare smile. "Good shot. Try again." They spent the next hour practicing, Rosalie's confidence growing with each successful hit. By the time they finished, she felt reasonably certain she could defend herself if necessary, though the thought of actually shooting someone made her stomach clench with dread. As they walked back toward the house, Thomas said quietly, "I hope you never have to use that against a person, Rosalie. It changes you, taking a life." The sadness in his voice made her heart ache for him. "Is that why you keep to yourself? Because of what happened in Texas?" Thomas was silent for several steps. "Partly," he finally admitted. "After Davidson and his wife were killed after the shooting was done, I saw myself differently, realized how quickly life can turn on a dime." He glanced at her. "But mostly, I keep to myself because it's safer for everyone that way. Men with grudges don't tend to let go easily." "Like Dirk Beck," Rosalie said. Thomas nodded. "Beck is dangerous because he doesn't care who gets hurt as long as he gets what he wants. And right now, what he wants is to see me suffer. By threatening the people you care about," Rosalie concluded, understanding dawning. "That's why you stay isolated, so there's no one they can use against you." Thomas stopped walking, turning to face her. "It's worked until now." The implication hung in the air between them that something had changed, that there was now someone Beck could use to hurt him, someone he cared about. Rosalie's heart beat faster at the realization. "Thomas!" The sound of approaching horses interrupted whatever she might have said. Both turned to see Roberto and Diego riding toward them at a gallop. "Señorita." "Señor O'Connor," Roberto called as they drew near. "Bar T men are moving cattle onto your land, the north pasture by the creek." Thomas was immediately alert, his hand moving to his gun. "How many?" "4 riders," Diego answered. "Beck is with them." Thomas turned to Rosalie. "Stay here. Lock the doors and keep that revolver handy." "No," Rosalie said firmly. "This is my land they're trespassing on. I'm coming with you." Thomas looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression must have told him it would be futile. "Stay behind me," he finally said. "And if shooting starts, you find cover immediately. Understood?" Rosalie nodded, retrieving the revolver before following Thomas to where the horses were tethered. As they rode toward the north pasture, Thomas positioned himself slightly ahead of her, his expression grim and focused. They crested a small rise, and Rosalie saw them Bar T cattle being driven onto her land, churning up the soft ground near the creek. 4 riders moved among them, and even from a distance, she recognized Dirk Beck's large frame. Thomas halted, signaling for the others to do the same. "Let me do the talking," he said quietly. "Beck is looking for an excuse to start trouble." As they rode closer, Beck spotted them, nudging his horse toward them while his men continued moving cattle across the creek. "Well, if it isn't the famous Thomas O'Connor," Beck called, his voice carrying across the distance. "And the lovely Miss Montgomery, too. This must be my lucky day." They drew to a halt about 20 feet from where Beck waited, his hand resting casually near his holstered gun. Thomas dismounted, helping Rosalie down before turning to face Beck. "You're on Montgomery land, Beck," he said calmly. "Take your cattle and go." Beck's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Now that's where you're wrong, O'Connor. This here is open range, always has been." "The property line is clearly marked," Rosalie said, stepping forward. "And you know it. My uncle maintained those markers for 20 years. Beck's gaze shifted to her, his expression darkening. "Your uncle understood how things work out here, Miss Montgomery. Shame you haven't learned those lessons yet." His eyes flicked back to Thomas. "Though I see you found yourself a teacher, not the wisest choice considering O'Connor's history." "I know all about Thomas's history," Rosalie replied evenly. "And I know about yours too, Mr. Beck. The question is, does your employer know you're using a personal vendetta to stir up trouble between ranches?" Beck's face flushed with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about, lady." "I think she does," Thomas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "This isn't about water rights or grazing land. This is about Texas." Beck's hand inched closer to his gun. "You've got a lot to answer for, O'Connor. The Blackwells were friends of mine." "The Blackwells murdered a man and his wife in their bed," Thomas replied. "Whatever happened after that, they brought on themselves." The tension between the men was palpable, the air charged with the potential for violence. Rosalie found herself gripping the revolver in her pocket, praying she wouldn't need to use it. "Take your cattle and go, Beck," Thomas said again. "This doesn't need to get ugly." For a long moment, Beck seemed to consider his options, his eyes darting between Thomas and Rosalie, then to Roberto and Diego, who had positioned themselves on either side. Finally, his gaze settled on something beyond them, and a slow smile spread across his face. "Well now, looks like the odds just changed," he said. Rosalie turned to see Henderson and several of his men riding toward them, rifles at the ready. Relief flooded through her, followed quickly by concern as she noticed Beck's men moving into position, their hands hovering near their weapons. "Beck," Henderson called as he approached. "I thought we settled this yesterday. The creek boundary stands as it has for 20 years. Take your cattle back to Bar T land." Beck's expression hardened. "This isn't just about the creek, Henderson, it's about justice. O'Connor here is wanted for murder in Texas. Law-abiding citizens have a duty to see he faces those charges." "There are no charges," Thomas said quietly. "The Texas Rangers investigated and ruled it self-defense, which you know perfectly well." Beck spat on the ground. "Rangers can be bought, same as any man." Henderson dismounted, approaching with cautious steps. "This has gone far enough, Beck. Whatever grudge you hold against O'Connor, this isn't the way to settle it. You're trespassing on Montgomery land, pushing cattle across established boundaries. That's the only issue at hand right now." The standoff continued, tension building with each passing moment. Rosalie's hand tightened around the revolver in her pocket, her heart pounding in her chest. She noticed Thomas shifting slightly, positioning himself between her and Beck. Finally, Beck seemed to come to a decision. With obvious reluctance, he signaled to his men. "Round 'em up. We're heading back." The relief was palpable as the Bar T men began turning the cattle, driving them back across the creek. But as Beck prepared to follow them, he paused, turning back to Thomas. "This isn't over, O'Connor. Not by a long shot. Blackwell's still looking for you, and when he finds out where you are." He let the threat hang in the air before riding away, following his men and cattle back to Bar T land. Only when they had disappeared from view did Rosalie release the breath she'd been holding. Thomas turned to her, his face etched with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Rosalie nodded, though she felt shaky now that the immediate danger had passed. "Yes." "Thank you for standing with me." Henderson approached, his expression grave. "That was too close for comfort. Beck's not going to let this go, especially now that his pride's been wounded." He mentioned Blackwell again, Thomas said. You were right about him sending word to Texas. Henderson nodded grimly. All the more reason to stay vigilant. He turned to Rosalie. Miss Montgomery, I must insist that you reconsider my offer, at least temporarily until this situation resolves. Rosalie looked from Henderson to Thomas, whose blue eyes held a mixture of concern and something deeper, something that made her heart beat faster despite the lingering danger. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Henderson, she said slowly, but this is my home. I won't be driven from it by threats. Henderson sighed. I expected as much. In that case, I'd like to station a couple of men here at least for the next few days. And, he added, looking at Thomas, I think O'Connor should stay as well. He knows Beck better than anyone and he can keep an eye on things. Thomas looked surprised by the suggestion. Sir, you can bunk in the line cabin on the edge of Miss Montgomery's property, Henderson clarified. It's close enough to respond quickly if there's trouble, but maintains proper appearances. Thomas glanced at Rosalie, something unspoken passing between them. If Miss Montgomery has no objections. None whatsoever, Rosalie replied, perhaps too quickly. That is, I would feel safer knowing you were nearby, Thomas. Henderson raised an eyebrow at their use of first names but made no comment. It's settled then. Jenkins and Carlson will stay as well, taking shifts on patrol. He turned to Rosalie. We'll get through this, Miss Montgomery. Just keep your wits about you and that revolver handy. As Henderson and his men prepared to leave, Thomas pulled Rosalie aside. I don't like this, he said quietly. Beck is making this personal, and that puts you in danger simply by association. I'm already involved, Thomas, Rosalie replied. The moment my property became part of this dispute, I was involved. The fact that She hesitated, then continued more softly. The fact that I care about what happens to you only makes me more determined to stand my ground. Thomas's expression softened, vulnerability briefly visible in his eyes before he masked it once more. I never meant to bring trouble to your door, Rosalie. You didn't, she assured him, but now that it's here, we'll face it together. As the sun began to set, Thomas rode out to the line cabin, promising to return at first light. Rosalie watched him go, a mixture of emotions swirling within her, fear for what the coming days might bring, but also a growing certainty about her feelings for this complex, honorable man who had ridden into her life just weeks ago. That night, as she prepared for bed, Rosalie found herself drawn to the window, looking out toward the distant line cabin where Thomas was staying. A small light flickered there, perhaps a lamp or candle, and she took comfort in knowing he was near. Opening her volume of Emerson, she found a passage she'd marked earlier. The only person you are destined to become is the person you decide to be. The words resonated deeply. In coming to New Mexico territory, in choosing to stay despite the danger, Rosalie was becoming someone new, someone stronger and more self-reliant than the Boston schoolteacher she had been. And Thomas, for all his efforts to remain isolated, was perhaps becoming someone new as well, someone who allowed himself to care again, despite the risks. With these thoughts, Rosalie finally drifted to sleep, the revolver on her bedside table and Emerson's words in her heart. The following days established a new rhythm. Thomas spent his days helping around the ranch, teaching Rosalie more about cattle and the land while Henderson's men patrolled the boundaries. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, talking as the sun set over the distant mountains. Rosalie learned more about Thomas's life before Texas, his childhood in Tennessee, his love of books fostered by a mother who had been a schoolteacher like herself, his dreams of someday having his own small ranch. In turn, she shared stories of Boston, of her parents and the life she'd left behind. With each passing day, the connection between them deepened, a tentative trust blooming into something more profound. A week passed without incident. No sign of Beck or his men, no cattle straying across boundaries. The tension began to ease, though Thomas remained vigilant, never allowing himself to fully relax. Then came the letter. Rosalie had ridden into Socorro with Roberto for supplies, leaving Thomas and one of Henderson's men to watch over the property. While at the general store, Mr. Wilson handed her an envelope. "This came for you yesterday, Miss Montgomery," he said. "Ryder from Santa Fe brought it." Rosalie thanked him, puzzled by who might be writing to her. The few acquaintances she'd left behind in Boston didn't have her New Mexico address. Opening the envelope as she walked back to her wagon, she found a single sheet of paper inside. The message was brief and chilling. "O'Connor has a price on his head. Anyone harboring him will be considered an accomplice. For your own safety, send him away. A friend." There was no signature, but Rosalie had little doubt about the source. Beck was trying a new tactic, attempting to isolate Thomas by threatening those who stood with him. She tucked the letter into her pocket, saying nothing to Roberto as they completed their errands and headed back to the ranch. But her mind was racing, considering the implications. If Beck was resorting to written threats, it suggested he was growing desperate or that something worse was brewing. When they arrived home, Thomas was mending a fence near the corral, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal sun-bronzed forearms. He looked up as she approached, a smile warming his usually serious features. "How was town?" he asked, setting aside his tools. Rosalie glanced around to ensure they were alone before withdrawing the letter from her pocket. "This was waiting for me at the store." Thomas read it quickly, his expression darkening with each word. When he looked up, his eyes were filled with a mixture of anger and resignation. "Beck," he said flatly. Rosalie nodded. "I assume so, though he could have at least signed his name if he wanted to intimidate me properly." Despite the situation, Thomas's lips quirked slightly at her attempt at humor. "You're not afraid of a cowardly note?" Rosalie shook her head. "No. But I am concerned about what it means. If Beck is trying to frighten me into sending you away, he must be planning something." Thomas folded the letter, his expression grim. "Or someone is coming. Someone Beck thinks will succeed where he's failed." "Blackwell," Rosalie said quietly. Thomas nodded. "It's possible." He looked at her intently. "Rosalie, maybe it would be better if I did leave, just for a while until this blows over." "No," she said firmly. "That's exactly what Beck wants. He's trying to isolate you to make you vulnerable." She stepped closer, placing her hand on his arm. "I'm not sending you away, Thomas. We face this together." The look he gave her was complex gratitude mixed with concern and something deeper that made her heart race. For a moment, Rosalie thought he might pull away, might insist on leaving to protect her. Instead, he covered her hand with his own. "Together, then," he said softly. "But we need to be even more careful now. No trips to town alone, no riding out on the property without someone with you." Rosalie agreed readily, knowing this wasn't the time to assert her independence. The threat was real, and Thomas's concern was warranted. That evening, Thomas rode to the rocking H to inform Henderson about the letter. When he returned, his expression was more troubled than before. "Henderson's heard rumors," he told Rosalie as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. "A stranger arrived in Santa Fe last week, asking questions about me. Description matches Frank Blackwell." Rosalie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "He's really come all this way for revenge," Thomas nodded grimly. "Some grudges run deep, especially when family's involved." "What are we going to do?" Rosalie asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "Henderson suggested I leave the territory for a while." Head further west, maybe to California or up to Colorado. Fear gripped Rosalie's heart. And what did you tell him? That I was done running, Thomas replied, turning to look at her. 5 years of looking over my shoulder, of keeping my distance from people, of never staying in one place too long. I'm tired of it, Rosalie. The raw honesty in his voice moved her deeply. Without thinking, she reached out, taking his hand in hers. Then we stand our ground, she said, together. Thomas's fingers tightened around hers, his blue eyes searching her face. Why are you doing this? Putting yourself at risk for a man you've known barely a month? Rosalie considered the question, knowing the answer was both simple and profound. Because in that month I've come to care for you, Thomas, more than I thought possible. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. And because I believe you care for me too, even though you've been trying not to. Thomas's expression softened, vulnerability replacing his usual reserve. I do care for you, Rosalie, more than I should allow myself to. He sighed, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. That's what terrifies me. Caring makes you vulnerable. It gives men like Beck and Blackwell power over you. It also gives you something worth fighting for, Rosalie countered softly. Something worth staying for instead of running. For a long moment, they sat in silence, their hands entwined as the last rays of sunlight painted the landscape in gold and crimson. Then, with a gentleness that made her heart ache, Thomas raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. I won't run, he promised. Not this time. The following day brought a flurry of activity as Henderson sent additional men to reinforce their position. The ranch became something of a fortress, with men stationed at key points around the property and regular patrols along the boundaries. Thomas insisted on moving from the line cabin to the bunkhouse, wanting to be closer to the main house in case of trouble. 3 days passed in this state of heightened alertness, with no sign of Beck or his men, nor any appearance by the mysterious Frank Blackwell. The tension was wearing on everyone, the constant vigilance exhausting. On the 4th day, as Rosalie and Thomas were checking the cattle in the south pasture, Henderson himself rode out to meet them, his expression grave. Frank Blackwell is in Socorro, he announced without preamble. Arrived last night. He's been asking questions about both of you. Thomas's hand moved instinctively to his gun. Both of us, Henderson nodded grimly. Word has spread about Miss Montgomery harboring you. Blackwell seems to think she might be useful in drawing you out. Rosalie felt a chill of fear, not for herself but for Thomas. What should we do? Henderson dismounted, his weathered face set in determined lines. I've sent for the marshal in Santa Fe, should be here in a couple of days. Until then, I want you both at the main ranch house. It's more defensible, and I have more men there. Thomas shook his head. I won't bring this fight to your doorstep, sir. Blackwell's quarrel is with me, not you or your men. And Beck's quarrel involves all of us now, Henderson countered. This isn't just about Texas anymore, Thomas. It's about who controls the water rights in this valley. Beck's using Blackwell to further his own agenda. Thomas considered this, his expression troubled. And what about Rosalie's property? We can't just abandon it. I'll leave men here, Henderson assured them. Roberto and 4 of my most trusted hands. They'll keep an eye on things until this is resolved. Rosalie looked between the 2 men, understanding the gravity of the situation. Thomas, I think Mr. Henderson is right. We'd be safer at the main ranch, at least until the marshal arrives. Thomas met her gaze, conflict clear in his eyes. She knew he was torn between the desire to protect her and the reluctance to put others at risk. Finally, he nodded. We'll come, he agreed. But at the first sign that Blackwell is headed toward the Rocking H, I'm riding out to meet him. I won't have anyone else caught in the crossfire of my past. Henderson clapped Thomas on the shoulder. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. The marshal may be able to resolve this without bloodshed. As they prepared to leave, Rosalie took a moment to gather a few personal belongings from the house clothing, her book of Emerson's essays, and a small photograph of her parents. She paused in the doorway, looking back at the home she'd begun to love. Would she ever return? Or would this conflict force her to abandon her uncle's legacy after all Thomas found her there, hesitating on the threshold? "We'll be back," he promised, reading her thoughts. "This isn't the end, Rosalie, just a temporary measure." She nodded, drawing strength from his certainty. "I know. It's just, for the first time since arriving here, I felt like I belonged somewhere, like I had found a home." Thomas's expression softened. "You have," he said quietly, "and when this is over, you'll return to it. We both will if you'll have me." The simple words held a wealth of meaning, a promise for the future, an acknowledgement of what had been growing between them. Rosalie's heart swelled with emotion. "I'll hold you to that, Thomas O'Connor," she said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. They rode to the rocking H together, surrounded by Henderson's men. The main ranch was impressive, a large house with several outbuildings, bunkhouses for the hands, and extensive corrals for the cattle. Mrs. Henderson, a practical woman with kind eyes, welcomed Rosalie warmly, showing her to a comfortable guest room. "Don't you worry," she assured Rosalie. "William and his men will sort this out. And in the meantime, I'm glad to have another woman to talk to. Gets lonely out here sometimes." Rosalie thanked her for the hospitality, touched by the older woman's kindness. After freshening up, she joined the Hendersons and Thomas for dinner, the conversation carefully steered away from the danger that had brought them together. Later that evening, Rosalie found herself unable to sleep, her mind too full of worry. Wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, she slipped out to the porch, hoping the night air might clear her thoughts. She was surprised to find Thomas already there, leaning against the railing as he gazed out at the starlit landscape. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked softly, moving to stand beside him. Thomas shook his head. "Too much on my mind." They stood in companionable silence for a moment. The night sounds of the ranch, distant cattle, the occasional whinny of a horse, the soft hooting of an owl creating a peaceful backdrop that belied the tension of their situation. "I've been thinking about what happens after," Rosalie finally said. "After this conflict with Beck and Blackwell is resolved one way or another." Thomas glanced at her. "And what have you concluded?" "That I want to stay," she replied. "Not just for a few months or a year, but permanently. I want to make a life here." She turned to face him fully. "And I hope you'll be part of that life, Thomas." In the moonlight, his expression was difficult to read, but she saw his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard. "Rosalie," he began, his voice husky with emotion, "you don't know what you're asking." "I think I do," she countered gently. "I'm asking you to stop running, to trust that we can face whatever comes together." Thomas turned to her, his eyes searching her face. "I've spent 5 years convinced that caring for anyone was a luxury I couldn't afford, that getting close to people only put them at risk." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "Then you came along with your Runaway Wagon and your Emerson, and suddenly all those careful walls I built started crumbling." Rosalie's heart raced at his words. "Is that such a bad thing?" "It terrifies me," he admitted. "Not just the danger from men like Beck and Blackwell, but—" he hesitated, struggling to find the words. "But the possibility of losing you once you've seen the real me. The man I was in Texas, the things I've done." Rosalie reached up, her hand gently touching his cheek. "Thomas, I've already seen the real you, the man who risked his life for a stranger, who quotes Emerson and teaches a city girl how to shoot, who stands his ground when it would be easier to run." Her voice softened. the man I've fallen in love with." Thomas went very still, his eyes widening at her declaration. For a moment, Rosalie feared she'd said too much, moved too quickly. Then his hand covered hers where it rested against his cheek. "I love you too," he said, the words seeming to surprise him as much as her. "God help me, but I do." The space between them vanished as Thomas pulled her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that spoke of longing held in check for too long. Rosalie responded with equal fervor, her hands sliding up to twine in his hair as she pressed closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. "That's not for you to decide," Rosalie replied with a small smile. "Besides, I think we deserve each other." Two stubborn people who refuse to be driven from what matters to them. Thomas chuckled, the sound warming her heart. "When you put it that way." The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the night, immediately putting them both on alert. Thomas stepped in front of Rosalie protectively, his hand moving to his gun as they peered into the darkness. A rider appeared, coming fast toward the house. As he drew closer, Rosalie recognized Roberto, his horse lathered from hard riding. "Señor O'Connor," he called, dismounting in a rush. "Señorita Montgomery, Bar T men have surrounded your ranch. They are looking for you both." Thomas was already moving, heading for the bunkhouse to alert Henderson's men. "How many?" he called over his shoulder. "At least 10, Roberto replied, following him. "Beck is with them, and another man I do not recognize, tall, with a scar on his face." "Blackwell," Thomas said grimly. "They're working together now." By the time Henderson emerged from the house, Thomas had saddled his horse and was checking his guns. The ranch owner took in the situation with a quick glance. "How long ago?" he asked Roberto. "I rode out as soon as I saw them approaching, Señor. Perhaps an hour now." Henderson turned to Thomas. "You're not thinking of riding there alone, are you?" Thomas's expression was resolute. "This has gone on long enough. I won't have anyone else hurt because of my past. And I won't have one of my best men riding into an ambush," Henderson countered sharply. He turned, calling orders to his foreman. "Gather the men. We ride in 20 minutes. Rosalie stepped forward. "I'm coming too." Thomas shook his head emphatically. "No, it's too dangerous." "It's my property they're trespassing on," Rosalie argued. "And if they're looking for both of us, as Roberto said, then I'm already involved." Thomas looked to Henderson for support, but the older man merely shrugged. "She has a point, O'Connor. Besides, we'll have enough men to keep her safe." Thomas's jaw clenched in frustration, but he knew when he was outnumbered. "You stay with the main group," he told Rosalie firmly. "And at the first sign of trouble, you find cover. Understood?" Rosalie nodded, already moving to saddle her horse. Within the promised 20 minutes, a force of 15 armed men, plus Rosalie, was riding toward the Montgomery ranch. The moon provided enough light to navigate, though Henderson set a careful pace to avoid accidents on the unfamiliar terrain. As they drew near the property, they dismounted, approaching the final rise on foot to assess the situation below. Thomas and Henderson crawled to the crest, peering down at the ranch house, which was illuminated by several lanterns. "I count 12 men," Henderson whispered. "Most around the house and barn, 2 keeping watch on the approaches." Thomas nodded, his eyes scanning the scene. "Beck is on the porch, and that's Blackwell beside him, the tall man with the duster." Henderson studied the layout, formulating a plan. "We'll split into 3 groups. My foreman will take 5 men around to the east, coming in behind the barn. I'll take another 5 and approach from the west, near the corral. You, Johnson, and Peters will create a distraction from the south, drawing their attention while we move into position." Thomas nodded, the strategy sound. "And Rosalie?" She stays here with Roberto and Jenkins until we've secured the area, Henderson replied firmly. Rosalie, who had crept up to join them, opened her mouth to protest, but closed it again at Thomas's warning look. This wasn't the time to argue. As the men prepared to move into position, Thomas took a moment to speak with Rosalie privately. "Stay low and out of sight," he instructed. "If shooting starts, you get on your horse and ride back to the rocking H. Don't wait for anyone, don't look back, just ride. Understood?" Rosalie nodded, her throat tight with fear not for herself but for him. "Be careful, Thomas, please." In the moonlight, his eyes were serious as they searched her face, memorizing every detail. "When this is over," he said softly, "we'll talk about that future you mentioned." Before she could respond, he leaned in, kissing her briefly but intensely. Then he was gone, moving silently into position with his assigned men. Rosalie watched anxiously as the Henderson men spread out, circling the ranch under cover of darkness. Roberto stayed beside her, his rifle ready, while Jenkins kept watch on their horses. Long minutes passed in tense silence. Then, suddenly, gunfire erupted from the south side of the property, Thomas and his men creating the promised distraction. Beck's men reacted immediately, several running toward the sound, weapons drawn. In that moment of confusion, Henderson and his groups moved in from both sides, catching the Bar T men in a pincer movement. More shots were fired, shouts echoing through the night air. Rosalie strained to see what was happening, her heart pounding as she tried to locate Thomas in the chaos below. She spotted him finally, moving from the cover of the corral toward the house, his gun raised. On the porch, Beck and Blackwell realized they were surrounded. Beck ducked inside the house, while Blackwell stood his ground, firing at the approaching rocking H men. "Drop your weapons," Henderson's voice boomed across the yard. "You're outnumbered," some of the Bar T men complied, raising their hands in surrender. Others continued to fight, ducking behind whatever cover they could find. Thomas had reached the edge of the porch, his attention focused on the door where Beck had disappeared. He was so intent on his target that he didn't notice Blackwell circling around the side of the house. Rosalie saw it happening, saw the danger before anyone else. Without thinking, she was on her feet, running down the slope despite Roberto's shout of warning. "Thomas!" she screamed. "Behind you!" Thomas turned at her voice, just in time to see Blackwell raising his gun. He dove for cover as shots rang out, returning fire from behind a water barrel. Rosalie kept running, ignoring Jenkins's call to stop. All she could think about was reaching Thomas, helping him somehow. She was halfway across the yard when Beck reappeared at the door, his rifle aimed not at Thomas or Henderson's men, but directly at her. Thomas saw it happen in slow motion, Beck's rifle swinging toward Rosalie, his finger tightening on the trigger. With a desperate lunge, Thomas broke from his cover, firing at Beck even as he ran toward Rosalie. His shot caught Beck in the shoulder, spinning the man around and sending his rifle shot wild. But the distraction left Thomas exposed to Blackwell, who took immediate advantage. 2 shots cracked through the night air. Thomas staggered, falling to one knee as Blackwell's bullet found its mark. From her position, Rosalie couldn't tell how badly he was hit, but she saw him raise his gun with trembling hands, firing back at Blackwell. The shot went wide and Blackwell laughed, a cold sound that carried across the yard. "5 years I've waited for this moment, O'Connor," he called. 5 years planning how to make you pay for my brothers." Thomas struggled to his feet, blood darkening his shirt along his side. "Your brothers were murderers, Blackwell," he replied, his voice strained but steady. "They killed innocent people." "They were family," Blackwell snarled, raising his gun for the killing shot. What happened next seemed to unfold in a blur. Rosalie, who had retrieved the small revolver Thomas had given her from her pocket, aimed at Blackwell with shaking hands. She squeezed the trigger just as Thomas had taught her, breathing out as she did. The shot caught Blackwell by surprise, striking him in the arm and throwing off his aim. His bullet went high, missing Thomas entirely. In that moment of confusion, Henderson's men closed in, disarming Blackwell and the remaining Bar T men who hadn't surrendered. Beck, wounded but still dangerous, was dragged from the house, cursing and threatening as he was restrained. Rosalie ran to Thomas, who had sunk back to his knees, one hand pressed against his bleeding side. "Thomas," she cried, kneeling beside him. "How badly are you hurt?" Thomas managed a pained smile. "Not as bad as it looks, I think. Caught me along the ribs, but missed anything vital." His expression grew serious. "You saved my life, Rosalie, but you could have been killed running out like that." "I couldn't just watch," she replied, helping him to his feet as Henderson approached. The ranch owner surveyed the scene with grim satisfaction. "We got them all. No casualties on our side, though O'Connor here needs patching up." He looked at Rosalie with new respect. "That was a fine shot, Miss Montgomery. Didn't know you had it in you." Rosalie's hands were still shaking from the adrenaline. "Neither did I, Mr. Henderson. Neither did I." With the danger past, Henderson's men secured the prisoners while Mrs. Martinez, who had been hiding in the bunkhouse during the confrontation, emerged to help tend to Thomas's wound. It was, as he had suspected, a flesh wound along his ribs, painful but not life-threatening. As dawn broke, the marshal from Santa Fe arrived with several deputies, having ridden through the night after receiving Henderson's message. He took charge of the prisoners, including Beck and Blackwell, who would face charges of trespassing, attempted murder, and in Beck's case, falsifying information about water rights. Blackwell might still try to press those old charges from Texas, the marshal told Thomas as his wound was being bandaged. "But from what Henderson's told me, and with witnesses to tonight's events, I doubt they'll stick. Self-defense is self-defense, whether it happened yesterday or 5 years ago." Thomas nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Marshal." As the prisoners were led away, Beck glared at Thomas and Rosalie. "This isn't over," he spat. "Not by a long shot." The marshal cuffed him roughly. "It's over for you, Beck. Threatening witnesses is just adding to your sentence." With the immediate danger past, Henderson and most of his men returned to the Rocking H, leaving a few hands to help repair the damage to Rosalie's property. Roberto and his family came to assist as well, bringing food and supplies to replace what had been used or destroyed by the Bar T men. That evening, as the sun set over the ranch, Rosalie found Thomas sitting on the porch, his bandaged torso making his movements stiff and careful. She joined him, handing him a cup of coffee before taking a seat beside him. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Like I've been shot," Thomas replied with a wry smile. "But I'll heal." He looked at her, his blue eyes serious. "The marshal says it could be months before Beck and Blackwell face trial. You might still face some harassment from their supporters." Rosalie nodded thoughtfully. "I suppose that's possible, but I won't let fear of what might happen stop me from living the life I want." She turned to face him fully. "What about you, Thomas? What happens now?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, his gaze on the distant mountains turning gold in the sunset. "Before all this started, I was saving to buy my own place. Nothing fancy, just a small spread where I could raise a few cattle, maybe some horses." He glanced at her. "But plans change." "How so?" Rosalie asked, her heart beating faster. Thomas set down his coffee cup, turning to take her hands in his. "I've been running for so long, Rosalie. Running from my past, from connections, from letting myself care too deeply about anyone or anything." His voice grew softer. Then you came along with your runaway wagon, and suddenly I had something I couldn't bear to run from. Rosalie's eyes filled with tears. Thomas, I love you, Rosalie Montgomery, he said simply. I love your courage, your determination, your willingness to stand your ground when it would be easier to flee. And if you'll have me, I'd like to stay not just nearby, but here with you, building something together. Joy welled up in Rosalie's heart, spilling over in her smile. I love you too, Thomas O'Connor, and yes, I'll have you here with me, building our future together. Thomas's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds rare and all the more precious for it. With gentle hands, he cupped her face, drawing her into a kiss that held all the promise of their shared future. When they finally broke apart, Rosalie rested her head against his shoulder, careful of his injury. You know, she said thoughtfully, my uncle's ledgers show the ranch could support more cattle than we currently have. With the right management, we could expand considerably. Thomas chuckled, his arm tightening around her. Already making plans, are you? Someone has to, she replied with a smile. Especially since you'll be recovering from that wound for a while. Doctor's orders, Thomas groaned. Henderson's already threatened to sit on me if I try to do too much too soon. Smart man, Rosalie said approvingly. I might enlist his help if you prove stubborn. They sat together as darkness fell, talking about their plans for the ranch, for their future together. The dangers they'd faced had only strengthened their bond, showing them both that some things were worth fighting for, worth standing your ground to protect. 3 months later, on a crisp autumn day, Rosalie Montgomery became Rosalie O'Connor in a small ceremony at the Socorro church. Henderson stood as Thomas's best man, while Mrs. Henderson and Senora Martinez helped Rosalie prepare for her new life. Roberto and his family provided music and food for the celebration that followed, the entire community turning out to wish them well. As they danced under the stars on their wedding night, Thomas held Rosalie close, his blue eyes reflecting the same love and wonder she felt in her own heart. Happy? He asked softly. Rosalie smiled up at her husband. More than I ever thought possible, she replied. And you? Any regrets about staying put instead of running? Thomas shook his head, his expression serious. Not a single one. You saved me from more than just Beck and Blackwell, Rosalie. You saved me from running away from love, from the chance at happiness I never thought I deserved. And you saved me from that runaway wagon, she reminded him with a smile. I'd say we're even. As they swayed together under the vast New Mexico sky, surrounded by friends who had become family, Thomas and Rosalie O'Connor knew they had found in each other not just love, but a home, a place to stand their ground together, come what may. Over the years that followed, the O'Connor ranch flourished. Thomas and Rosalie worked side by side, expanding their cattle operation and eventually breeding horses as well. They became known throughout the territory for their fair dealings and hospitality, their home a gathering place for neighbors and travelers alike. Beck and Blackwell both served time for their crimes, and though Beck occasionally made threats upon his release, he never dared act on them. The respect Thomas had earned in the community, combined with his own reputation as a man who stood his ground, kept potential troublemakers at bay. 2 years after their wedding, Rosalie gave birth to their first child, a son they named Samuel, after her uncle. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 3 years later, and another son, James, 2 years after that. The children grew up strong and capable, learning the values of hard work, courage, and standing up for what was right from parents who exemplified those qualities. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas presented Rosalie with a specially bound collection of Emerson's essays, including Self-Reliance, that had first revealed their shared love of literature. For the woman who taught me that true self-reliance isn't about standing alone, he wrote inside the cover, but about having the courage to stand with those you love. Rosalie, in turn, gave Thomas the deed to the expanded property. They now owned the original Montgomery ranch combined with adjacent land they had purchased over the years, officially renamed the O'Connor Ranch. "For the man who saved me from a runaway wagon," she wrote on the accompanying card, "and gave me a life more adventurous and fulfilling than any Boston schoolteacher could have imagined." As they sat on their porch that evening, watching their children play in the yard while the sun set over land that had become truly theirs, Thomas took Rosalie's hand, his touch as familiar and necessary as breathing. "You ever miss Boston?" he asked, curious rather than concerned after all these years. Rosalie shook her head, smiling at the three dark-haired children who had their father's blue eyes and their mother's determination. "Not for a moment," she replied honestly. "This is home. It always will be." Thomas squeezed her hand, his expression one of contentment that had once seemed impossible to the solitary cowboy who had ridden into her life on that fateful day in Socorro. "Home," he agreed softly. "Worth every fight to protect it." As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, Thomas and Rosalie O'Connor remained on their porch, hands entwined, hearts full, two souls who had saved each other in every way that mattered, who had built a life neither could have imagined alone, and who had found in each other the courage to stand their ground, no matter what came their way.